Hello and welcome to today's show. It's a case study. It's the French memoir Blown Out of Proportion, The Misadventures of a Glassblower in France, and it's by author Rachel Caldicott. The show today though is sponsored by the Structure Success Video Training, which is a free training that helps you come up with an outline for your book, and I'll have details for you on how you can get a hold of this at the end of the show. Forever Young Autobiographies, for those who are new, is all about learning how to write life stories for family and friends. And it'd be wonderful if you could follow, subscribe and like the show. So Caldicott said she needed to build her writing confidence to produce this memoir. Even though she grew up in a bookie family, her mother was a writer, her father was a publisher, she felt like she was after something else. When she was young, she dabbled in all kinds of things. But the writing bug eventually caught up with her in April when she published this memoir. And it tells the story of her and her husband and her kids moving to France to start a glass blowing studio in this impoverished, sleepy town. And they encounter scorpions, they encounter eccentric locals, corrupt politicians. There's even some legal battles. So that's a little bit of an introduction, but I caught up more with Caldicott and she went through a bit more about the book, how she wrote it, and some tips for new writers. So let's kick it off with a little bit more about Caldicott. So as I mentioned, grew up in England. She had many jobs when she was young. She went to art school. She was involved in theatre, I think. She was an editor for a 16mm film. She travelled a lot, was working for a Japanese travel company at one point, and also some NGOs. So she had a really fun younger stage of her life until she got to when she was 34. Surprisingly, she says, she met her husband, Chris, and they got married quite quickly, and they had their first child and then their second child. And that's when they made the move to France to set up a glass blowing studio. She says their experience, their travelling experience, was different to others who had done this. And she said she started to write emails back to friends and family, detailing their trip and their experiences. And her friends and family wrote back and said, "You really need to write a book about this. It's so good." So she accidentally fell into the memoir project. She wasn't ready to write the book though, she says, just because people tell you that. She didn't think it was quite right. She instead started a little book about the history of the town where she was in France, and that ended up being for sale in like local supermarkets and around the town. So that was sort of dipping her toes into the water and gaining this writing confidence. But her brother, who was a writer, suggested, well, if you don't want to write a book, why don't you turn some of these emails into blog posts? And so she tentatively did this, and she did talk to a literary consultant who said, look, you could restructure this, so have your themes as a chapter. Each theme has a chapter throughout the book. She then said life got in the way, the project went on the back burner. She actually wrote a novel in between things, and she started writing about the refugee crisis that was at this stage happening in Europe. So that's a bit of background, but let's move on to the writing, the publishing stage too of the book. So she says it wasn't until last year in 2020 that she had a novel out of the way, and she went back to the memoir, and she thought she had a bit of confidence now. I'm going to approach some agents, but look, nothing there eventuated it apart from an agent suggesting, look, chapters and themes, they rarely work. Why don't you put it all back into chronological order? Which is what she did with a bit of grumbling, she admits. But she took advantage of coronavirus lockdown and she reorganised the book. She organised a cover and came up with a title. Well, her son helped come up with a title. In frustration, he said, oh, for goodness sake, why don't you call it Blown Out of Proportion? Which is what happened. So that's sort of the process of the book, from writing all the way to publishing. But there were some challenges, Caldicott said. She said Firstly, writing these letters to these agents was hard, summarising a whole book into just one page for a letter, and also girding her loins for any criticisms. She said, look, a lot of books have this one big disaster, and the reader gets on the side of the author because this author's having this challenge, they're overcoming this challenge, and they're caring for the writer. In her book, she said they didn't really have a big challenge. They had a lot of little smaller challenges. So she feels like that she was able to overcome that, to get the reader on their side, because being honest and saying, look, we didn't always make the right decisions, we made mistakes, but this is how it was. And so that's how she overcame that challenge. But with challenges, there's rewards. And the biggest reward for this process was Caldecott saying her children told her that they were so proud of her for writing this memoir, that it really did highlight their time in France, why they stayed. Really, really good feedback from people who matter most, the children. But to finish the show, I'm going to share some tips with you that Caldecott had for new writers. Now, these are really important because all writers can learn from one another. And Caldecott says, number one, the first lesson that she wants to share was to take notes and do your research. Keep records. That's really important when you're writing a life story. Also, do a rough first draft and then take a break. She suggests 4 months, take a break, and then come back to it with fresh eyes. Don't be afraid of hard work was another tip, because writing is hard work. Yes, it does take a little bit of effort, but you're aiming to write an account that's almost like a novel in that it has flow to it and it's interesting for your reader. So that's really important. And finally, the last tip she had was to be honest with your reader. So don't portray yourself as someone who you're not, because your readers, they want, they expect, and they deserve honesty from a life story. And they're actually going to respect you as a writer if you are being honest. So a really important message is there for new writers from Caldecott. So there you have it. There's the amazing story. It's of love, it's of glass blowing, and it's of a young family's gutsy move to France. And this is the French memoir, Blown Out of Proportion. So to recap, we talked a little bit about Caldecott, how she wrote the book, the production, the publishing phase, and then some tips for new writers. So I'm sharing all of this. These case studies are really important because it gives you inspiration to hear from others who've trodden the life story writing path before you. And in this instance, I hope you take away that you can build your writing confidence over time, just like Caldecott, so you can finish your own life story. So this show is a summary, a small snapshot of a bigger article I have on this topic over at my website. So if you go to foreveryoungautobiographie.com/blown out of proportion, you will find it there. And there's pictures of the book, there's pictures of Caldecott now and when she was younger with the kids. And there's also links to resources that might be helpful for you. Things like theme or other publishing resources. So please check that out. And I will leave links for that article down below or in the show notes. And while you're here with me, I'd love to ask you a question. You can put your answer in the comments or you can leave it in the comments over at the article. So the question is, this memoir was set in France, or time, a period of life when Caldecott had a young family. And I want to know, are you doing a memoir too? And what time period are you writing about? This is really interesting because memoirs are different to autobiographies, which is a full life story. Memoirs is just a slice of life. So let's share with each other, what type of memoir are we writing? What time period are you writing about? So before I go, I wanted to highlight the Structure Success video training, which I mentioned at the top of the show. This will help you identify key memories and key events that you want to write about. And then we organize them. We get the structure right from the get-go. To get a handle on this training, you need to go to foreveryoungautobiographies.com/structure success sign up. Again, the links will be in the show notes or down below. So this training is really helpful if you're planning to write, you're writing, or you're polishing your work ready for publication. You've got to make sure that the story as a whole is correct, is best you can make it. So this training will really help you identify that. So please check it out. And before I go, remember, following, subscribing and liking the show is something wonderful you can do for me, because it lets you know when another show comes out. And another show on another topic will be out really soon. So until then, everybody, happy writing.